There comes a moment in a man's life when he realizes everything he worked for has slipped through his fingers like sand. Daniel Reyes felt that crushing weight as he sat in his old pickup truck, homeless at 53, with only his grandfather's faded journal keeping him company. The leather book held strange maps of a jungle waterfall and cryptic notes about hidden secrets. Most people would dismiss it as fantasy, but Daniel had nowhere else to turn. He followed those hand-drawn sketches deep into the wilderness, searching for something, anything, that might give his life meaning again. Behind a thundering waterfall, he found a cave that no one had entered for decades. Inside lay treasures worth $67 million, but the real discovery would test everything he believed about right and wrong. What would you do if finding fortune meant facing the ghosts of history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Reyes had always believed that a man's worth could be measured by the legacy he left behind. For 28 years, he'd stood before countless students, bringing history to life with the same passion that had once earned him the district's Teacher of the Year award. The tarnished plaque now sat in a cardboard box beside him, wrapped in newspaper like a forgotten relic from someone else's life. The box contained the remnants of his former existence, lesson plans he'd crafted with care, letters of appreciation from students who'd gone on to become doctors and engineers, and photographs from school events where he'd been respected, valued, needed. Now it all felt like archaeological evidence of a civilization that had crumbled beneath the weight of budget cuts and bureaucratic indifference. 6 months ago, Daniel had been Professor Reyes to his community college students, the teacher who could make the fall of Rome feel as immediate as yesterday's news. He had a small apartment near campus, a reliable routine, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he made a difference. Then came the letter: budget constraints, program elimination, position terminated. 28 years of dedication, summarized in 3 paragraphs of corporate speak. His ex-wife Sarah had tried to be supportive during those first weeks of unemployment. Their divorce 5 years earlier had been amicable enough, born more from growing apart than any dramatic betrayal. She still cared about him, worried about their 25-year-old daughter Emma's relationship with her father. Sarah worked as a nurse practitioner now, stable and practical, everything Daniel used to be. "You'll find something," she'd assured him over coffee at their usual diner. "History teachers are always in demand." But the months of rejection letters proved otherwise. School districts were cutting programs, not hiring. Private schools wanted younger faces with higher energy. Online education companies wanted tech-savvy millennials who could create viral content about the Renaissance. At 53, Daniel found himself caught between worlds, too experienced to be affordable, too old to be trendy. The apartment went first. Without income, he couldn't make rent, and his small savings evaporated faster than morning dew. He'd moved into a weekly motel, then a friend's couch, then the back seat of his 15-year-old Ford pickup. Each step down the ladder of respectability felt like shedding another layer of skin, revealing someone he didn't recognize underneath. Emma had offered help, of course. She lived in Portland now, working for a non-profit that advocated for sustainable agriculture. Her apartment was small, but she had a couch and a generous heart. Daniel had visited once, sleeping on her lumpy sofa for 3 weeks while he applied for jobs in Oregon. But watching his daughter's worried glances, hearing her careful conversations with friends about her situation with Dad, made him feel like a burden rather than a father. "I need to figure this out on my own," he'd told her, though the words tasted like defeat. Emma had inherited his stubborn streak, along with his dark eyes and quick mind. She'd wanted to argue, but she'd also inherited enough wisdom to know when to let a man maintain his dignity. That's when he'd returned to his grandfather's house in San Antonio, the place where he'd spent childhood summers listening to stories that seemed too fantastic to be true. Miguel Reyes had been a cartographer during World War II, assigned to Pacific Island mapping operations that helped plan Allied advances. But after the war, something had changed in the old man. He'd become obsessed with returning things to their proper places, talking endlessly about maps that showed locations of lost treasures and stolen heritage. As a child, Daniel had loved these stories. Grandfather Miguel would spread out hand-drawn maps on the kitchen table, pointing to remote jungles and hidden caves, spinning tales of ancient civilizations and colonial plunder. He spoke of a great cave behind a waterfall, where Spanish conquistadors had hidden artifacts they'd stolen from indigenous peoples, intending to return for them, but never managing the journey back. "Someday, Daniel," the old man would say, his weathered finger tracing routes through imaginary mountains, "someone from our family will make this right. We carry the guilt of what was taken, and we must carry the responsibility to return it." Daniel's parents had dismissed these stories as the fantasies of an aging mind, affected by too many years of isolation. After Miguel's death, when Daniel was 16, the maps and journals had been packed away, forgotten in an attic trunk that gathered dust for decades. But standing in that empty house last month, facing eviction from the family property due to unpaid taxes, Daniel had found himself drawn to that old trunk. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved by dry Texas air, was his grandfather's life work. Dozens of hand-drawn maps, detailed journals filled with careful observations, and photographs of artifacts that looked like museum pieces. The leather journal was the centerpiece of the collection, bound in dark cowhide and worn smooth by handling. Miguel's careful script filled every page, mixing English and Spanish as he documented his research into what he called the Great Hiding Place. The maps showed remarkable detail for hand-drawn work, topographical features, compass readings, even notes about seasonal water levels and wildlife patterns. Most striking were the photographs. Black and white images of golden figurines, ceramic vessels painted with intricate designs, jade ornaments that seemed to glow even in the old pictures. At the bottom of each photo, Miguel had written careful notes about historical significance and cultural origin. These weren't random treasures, they were specific artifacts from specific indigenous groups, stolen during specific colonial campaigns. Daniel had spent weeks studying the materials, cross-referencing his grandfather's notes with historical records and archaeological surveys. The location described in the journal was real, a remote region in the mountains between Guatemala and Belize, accessible only by foot and known to locals as a place where spirits dwelt behind falling water. What had seemed like fantasy began to feel like possibility. Miguel hadn't been a delusional old man, spinning tales for his grandson's entertainment. He'd been a careful researcher, a trained cartographer who'd spent his final decades trying to correct historical injustices he'd somehow become aware of during his military service. The more Daniel read, the more he understood his grandfather's burden. Miguel had discovered the location of these hidden artifacts through military intelligence channels, but he'd also learned about the communities they'd been stolen from. The guilt of knowing but not acting had consumed his later years, driving him to create detailed plans for their eventual return. Now, sitting in his truck with everything he owned, reduced to 3 cardboard boxes and a half-empty gas tank, Daniel felt the weight of that inherited responsibility. The teaching award plaque seemed to mock him. What good was understanding history if you couldn't apply its lessons to your own life? His phone buzzed with another text from Emma. "Dad, please call me. I'm worried." He'd been avoiding her calls for a week, unable to explain that he was living in his truck, unable to admit how far he'd fallen. What could he tell her? That her educated, responsible father had become another middle-aged casualty of economic indifference. The journal lay open beside him, Miguel's careful map pointing toward what might be redemption or merely the final chapter in a family legacy of failure. The logical part of his mind recognized the insanity of chasing his grandfather's treasure-hunting fantasies. He had maybe $400 to his name, a vehicle that needed new brakes, and no real survival skills beyond what he'd learned from camping trips with Emma years ago. But the alternative was admitting defeat, calling Emma to beg for help he wasn't sure he deserved, or finding some minimum-wage job that would slowly erode what remained of his self-respect. At least his grandfather's quest offered the possibility of meaning, even if it led nowhere but deeper into the wilderness of his own desperation. Daniel traced the route with his finger, following the path Miguel had mapped through mountain passes and jungle valleys to the site marked with a careful star. Below the star, in his grandfather's precise handwriting, were the words, "Here lies our chance to make history, serve justice instead of conquest." As evening shadows lengthened across the parking lot where he'd spent the night, Daniel made his decision. He would follow his grandfather's map, not because he believed in treasure hunting, but because some journeys were worth taking regardless of their destination. Even if the cave held nothing but his own delusions, at least he would be moving forward instead of simply surviving another day of systematic failure. He carefully closed the journal and placed it in the seat beside him, then started the truck's reluctant engine. The gas gauge showed less than a quarter tank, but it would be enough to reach the border. After that, he would trust in his grandfather's careful planning and his own desperate need to believe that some stories were worth their telling. The teaching award plaque caught a glint of sunset through the windshield, its tarnished surface reflecting light like a promise half remembered. Perhaps there were different ways to educate, different classrooms than the ones that had closed their doors to him. Perhaps his grandfather's final lesson was about to begin. The border crossing into Guatemala felt like stepping through a doorway into his grandfather's world. Daniel had driven through the night, nursing his truck's aging engine through the Texas hill country and down into the humid embrace of Central America. His Spanish, rusty from years of disuse, came back in fragments as he navigated checkpoints and explained his purpose as research into historical sites. The immigration officer, a weathered man with kind eyes, stamped Daniel's passport with casual efficiency. "Investigación histórica?" he asked, glancing at the journal Daniel kept close beside him. "My grandfather was a cartographer," Daniel replied in careful Spanish. "I'm following his work." The officer nodded with understanding. Many Americans came south chasing family histories, seeking connections to something larger than themselves. He waved Daniel through with a blessing for safe travels, unaware that he was witnessing the beginning of a quest that would challenge everything Daniel believed about ownership, justice, and the weight of inherited guilt. Daniel's truck labored up mountain roads that grew narrower and more treacherous with each mile. The journal's directions were precise but dated bridges that had collapsed, villages that had relocated, landmarks changed by decades of weather and human activity. Yet the basic geography remained unchanged, and Miguel's careful notations about elevation and compass headings proved reliable guides through the maze of possibilities. On his second day in country, Daniel stopped for fuel in a small town, whose name didn't appear on any modern map, but matched perfectly with his grandfather's notes. The gas station was little more than a few pumps and a concrete building that served as both store and informal community center. Local men gathered in the shade, sharing news and watching the stranger with polite curiosity. Daniel approached the group with the journal open, showing them Miguel's hand-drawn map of the region. "Excuse me," he said in Spanish, "I'm looking for this area, near the waterfall with 2 drops." An elderly man with silver hair and intelligent eyes leaned forward to study the map. His expression changed from casual interest to something approaching recognition. "This drawing," he said slowly, "it looks like the work of El Cartógrafo Loco." "The crazy cartographer." Daniel's pulse quickened. "You knew him?" "Not personally, but my father did. An American, very serious man who came here many times in the 1970s and 80s. Always asking questions about old places, sacred places." The man's tone carried a note of caution. My father said he carried much sadness, like a man trying to heal wounds that were not his own. Daniel felt a chill of recognition. This was his grandfather, the obsessed researcher who had spent his final decades trying to make amends for historical crimes he couldn't forget. What did people think of him? The elderly man considered this carefully. He was respectful, never took anything, never disturbed the old sites. But he asked many questions about things that happened long ago, during the time of conquest. Some people thought he was seeking treasure, others believed he was seeking forgiveness. As Daniel prepared to leave, the man approached his truck with something wrapped in faded cloth. "If you are truly his grandson," he said, "then you should have this. My father kept it, said someday someone from the cartographer's family would return." Inside the cloth was a small silver pendant, roughly the size of a coin, engraved with symbols that looked indigenous in origin. At its center was a compass rose, but the cardinal directions were marked with glyphs rather than letters. The pendant was attached to a leather cord that had been carefully preserved despite its obvious age. "Your grandfather dropped this during his last visit," the man explained. "My father found it near the old trail that leads to the cascade the double waterfall. He tried to return it, but the American had already left and never came back." Daniel examined the pendant with growing excitement. The symbols matched notations in the journal's margins, careful drawings he'd assumed were decorative, but now realized were functional elements of his grandfather's research. This wasn't just a lucky charm, it was a key to understanding the deeper layers of Miguel's work. That evening, camped beside a mountain stream with his grandfather's journal open by firelight, Daniel studied the pendant more carefully. The compass rose aligned perfectly with magnetic north when hung freely, but the indigenous glyphs suggested it served additional purposes beyond simple navigation. Cross-referencing with Miguel's notes revealed references to the old wisdom and guidance from those who came before. The journal's later entries took on new meaning with the pendant in hand. Miguel had written extensively about the spiritual significance of the Waterfall site, how indigenous peoples had considered it sacred long before Spanish conquistadors arrived to plunder their treasures. The cave behind the waterfall wasn't just a hiding place, it was a sanctuary that had been violated by colonial greed and forgotten by history. Daniel's sleep that night was filled with vivid dreams. He saw his grandfather as a young soldier, processing intelligence reports about archaeological sites that were being looted by unofficial treasure hunters among the occupying forces. He witnessed Miguel's growing horror as he realized the scale of cultural theft being committed in the name of military necessity. Most powerfully, he experienced his grandfather's decades-long struggle with guilt over knowledge that came too late to prevent the crimes, but early enough to demand action. The next morning brought mechanical trouble that would change everything. Daniel's truck, pushed beyond its limits by mountain driving and loaded down with camping gear, developed an ominous knocking in the engine. By noon, it had died completely on a remote stretch of road, still 20 miles from the Waterfall region described in the journal. A local farmer with a mule-drawn cart helped him push the truck to the side of the road, out of the path of occasional traffic. The man's assessment of the engine damage was delivered with sympathetic certainty. "This vehicle will not take you where you need to go, amigo." Daniel faced a moment of truth. He could arrange for the truck to be towed back to town, spend his remaining money on repairs that might or might not succeed, and abandon his grandfather's quest for practical concerns. Or he could leave the truck behind and continue on foot, carrying only what he could manage on his back through terrain that grew more challenging with every mile. The pendant seemed to grow warm against his chest as he considered his options. Miguel's journal contained detailed notes about the final approach to the waterfall, a 3-day hike through jungle paths that were barely marked on any official map. His grandfather had made this journey multiple times, documenting every landmark and potential hazard with the thoroughness of a military scout. Daniel transferred his essential supplies to a hiking pack: water purification tablets, basic camping gear, emergency food, and of course the journal and pendant. Everything else, including the cardboard boxes containing his former life, would remain with the truck, artifacts of a world he was leaving behind. The farmer offered a blessing as Daniel shouldered his pack and began walking toward the mountains. "Vaya con Dios, Professor," he said, somehow intuiting Daniel's former profession. "May you find what you seek, and may what you seek be worthy of the finding." The first miles were deceptively easy, following established paths through cultivated valleys, where children waved from village doorways and dogs barked half-hearted warnings at the passing stranger. But as the elevation increased and civilization fell behind, Daniel entered the realm his grandfather had mapped, with such careful attention to detail. The pendant became his compass and guide, its ancient symbols aligning with landscape features in ways that seemed to transcend mere coincidence. When the path forked, the pendant would swing toward the correct choice. When storm clouds gathered, it would warm against his skin in time for him to seek shelter. By the end of his second day on foot, Daniel had begun to understand that his grandfather's quest involved more than archaeological recovery. It was a spiritual journey that demanded faith as much as knowledge. On the third morning, he heard the sound that had drawn his grandfather across decades and continents, the thunderous roar of water falling from impossible heights, echoing through mountain valleys like the voice of the earth itself, calling him home. The sound of the waterfall reached Daniel before he could see it, a deep rumbling that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than fall from the sky. He followed the growing thunder through dense jungle growth, where vines thick as his arm created natural cathedrals and exotic birds called warnings to invisible neighbors. Every step forward felt like traveling backward through time, away from the modern world that had rejected him and toward something ancient and unchanging. Miguel's journal became increasingly crucial as the terrain grew more challenging. The path, if it could be called that, was little more than a series of animal trails and natural clearings connected by his grandfather's careful observations. Daniel found himself checking compass headings against the pendant's mysterious guidance, trusting in a navigation system that blended modern technique with indigenous wisdom. His body protested the demands of jungle hiking. At 53, he was carrying more weight than he'd managed in years, and his academic lifestyle had left him poorly prepared for the physical challenges of his grandfather's quest. Blisters formed and burst on his feet. Mosquito bites covered his arms despite generous applications of repellent. His back ached from the unaccustomed weight of the pack, and his knees complained about the constant ups and downs of mountain terrain. But as discomfort mounted, so did his sense of connection to something larger than his personal struggles. The jungle around him pulsed with life that seemed almost conscious, plants that moved without wind, animals that watched from shadows with intelligent eyes. Even the quality of light that filtered through the canopy seemed different here, older and more intentional. On his second day in the deep jungle, Daniel made a discovery that validated his grandfather's careful research. Near a natural clearing, where 3 streams converged, partially buried under decades of leaf litter and jungle growth, he found what looked like a piece of carved bone. Brushing away the debris revealed an object that made his heart race with excitement and recognition. The bone whistle was about 6 inches long, carved from what appeared to be a large bird's leg bone. Its surface was decorated with intricate patterns that matched symbols from the pendant and journal. Despite its obvious age, the whistle felt solid in his hands, preserved by the jungle's humid environment that prevented the cracking and brittleness that would have destroyed it in a drier climate. Daniel examined the artifact with the careful attention his years of teaching history had trained into habit. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had carved this whistle possessed both artistic skill and deep understanding of acoustics. The finger holes were precisely placed, and the mouthpiece had been shaped to produce maximum volume with minimal breath. Almost without thinking, Daniel raised the whistle to his lips and blew a tentative note. The sound that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a clear tone that seemed to hang in the humid air longer than physics should have allowed. As the note faded, he heard something that made him freeze in wonder, an echo, but not a simple repetition of his sound. The jungle itself seemed to be answering, as if the whistle had awakened something that had been sleeping for centuries. He tried again, this time playing a simple melody that came to him intuitively. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The sound of water, not just falling water, but water moving in patterns that suggested artificial channels or carefully shaped natural formations. The whistle wasn't just a musical instrument, it was a communication device designed to interact with the acoustic properties of the waterfall site. That night, camping in the same clearing where he'd found the whistle, Daniel experienced the most vivid dreams of his journey. He saw the jungle as it had existed before European contact, populated by people who understood their environment with an intimacy that modern civilization had forgotten. He watched ceremonies where the bone whistle played a central role, calling spirits from the waterfall cave and maintaining connections between the physical and spiritual worlds. In his dreams, Daniel met his grandfather as a young man, strong and confident in his military uniform, processing intelligence reports about archaeological sites being systematically looted by treasure hunters who operated under cover of military occupation. He witnessed Miguel's growing horror as he realized that his own mapping work was being used to facilitate the theft of irreplaceable cultural artifacts. The most powerful dream showed Miguel in his later years, standing at the same clearing where Daniel now camped, holding the same bone whistle and trying to communicate with spirits he believed were calling for justice. The old man's face was etched with decades of guilt, his eyes haunted by knowledge of crimes he had been powerless to prevent but morally obligated to address. Daniel woke with tears on his cheeks and a profound understanding of his grandfather's burden. Miguel hadn't been seeking treasure in any conventional sense. He had been seeking redemption, trying to bridge the gap between cultures that historical violence had torn apart. The bone whistle represented more than indigenous craftsmanship. It symbolized the possibility of communication across cultural boundaries, if approached with proper respect and understanding. The whistle's discovery also confirmed the accuracy of Miguel's research. If this artifact had survived decades of jungle conditions in the exact location the journal indicated, then other elements of his grandfather's work were likely equally reliable. The cave behind the waterfall wasn't mythology, it was documented reality, waiting for someone with the knowledge and determination to find it. As Daniel prepared to break camp for his final approach to the waterfall site, he reflected on how much had changed since he'd left his broken-down truck 3 days earlier. The desperate man who had begun this journey seeking financial salvation was being replaced by someone who understood that the real treasure might be something that couldn't be measured in dollars. The bone whistle hung from a cord around his neck, alongside the compass rose pendant, creating a growing collection of artifacts that seemed to be guiding him towards something larger than personal redemption. He was no longer just following his grandfather's map, he was following in his grandfather's footsteps, inheriting not just knowledge, but responsibility. The sound of falling water grew stronger as he hiked through the morning, accompanied now by acoustic phenomena he was beginning to recognize as responses to the whistle's calls. The jungle itself seemed to be welcoming him home, accepting him as someone who had earned the right to approach the sacred site through proper understanding rather than exploitation. By afternoon, Daniel could see mist rising through the jungle canopy ahead, marking the location of the cascade that had drawn his grandfather across decades of obsessive research. The bone whistle grew warm against his chest, as if anticipating reunion with its natural acoustic partner. Whatever waited behind the falling water, Daniel knew he was finally prepared to face it with the respect and understanding his grandfather had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate. The waterfall revealed itself gradually, like a secret being shared by the jungle itself. First came the mist, rising through the canopy in crystalline clouds that caught sunlight and transformed it into brief rainbows. Then the sound grew from a distant rumble to a roar that made the ground tremble beneath Daniel's feet. Finally, pushing through a curtain of hanging vines, he stepped into a natural amphitheater that took his breath away. The cascade double waterfall was everything his grandfather's careful descriptions had promised, and more. Two streams of water, each easily 50 feet wide, plunged from a limestone cliff nearly 200 feet above. They fell in parallel columns before joining in a pool that reflected the sky like a mirror made of liquid sapphire. The force of their impact created a constant spray that nourished gardens of orchids and ferns growing from every crack in the surrounding rock walls. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, overwhelmed by the natural cathedral that surrounded him. This wasn't just a waterfall, it was a shrine, created by geological forces and perfected by centuries of indigenous reverence. The acoustic properties were extraordinary. Every sound was amplified and refined, creating a natural echo chamber that turned the bone whistle's simple melodies into symphonic complexity. He made camp in a sheltered spot Miguel's journal had recommended, a natural overhang that provided protection from the constant mist while offering a clear view of both waterfalls. As evening approached, Daniel began the careful process of studying his grandfather's detailed notes about finding the hidden entrance to the cave system. The journal's later pages contained increasingly technical observations about light angles, water levels, and acoustic phenomena. Miguel had visited this site multiple times across several decades, documenting seasonal variations and mapping the complex relationship between natural forces and human access to the sacred space. His notes revealed a mind equally comfortable with military precision and spiritual sensitivity. As Daniel read by lamplight, a particular passage caught his attention. The entrance reveals itself only when approached with proper understanding. The ancients built more than physical barriers, they created tests of worthiness that survive in the stone itself. Near his feet, partially embedded in the sandy soil of his campsite, Daniel noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Using his knife, he carefully excavated what appeared to be a fragment of carved stone, roughly circular and about the size of his palm. The artifact was heavier than its size suggested, made from a dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The stone calendar fragment was covered with intricate carvings that included astronomical symbols, numerical notations, and what looked like a partial map of the waterfall area. Most intriguingly, several of the symbols matched glyphs from both the bone whistle and the compass rose pendant. This wasn't just another ancient artifact, it was part of a connected system of knowledge that his grandfather had been trying to decode. Daniel spent hours comparing the calendar fragment's markings with his grandfather's notes, gradually understanding that Miguel had been documenting more than geographical features. The old cartographer had been mapping temporal relationships, specific times when celestial alignments would reveal hidden aspects of the cave system. The fragment's astronomical notations indicated optimal viewing angles for different seasons and times of day. According to Miguel's calculations, the cave entrance would only become visible when sunlight struck the waterfall at precisely the right angle, creating optical effects that revealed openings normally hidden by the play of light and shadow on wet stone. Daniel's first attempts to locate the cave entrance were humbling failures. Despite following his grandfather's directions with mathematical precision, he found nothing but solid rock walls behind the falling water. The spray was powerful enough to knock him off his feet, and the rocks were so slippery that each exploration attempt risked serious injury. On his third day at the waterfall, Daniel nearly died from his own determination. Convinced that he was missing some crucial element of his grandfather's instructions, he attempted to climb closer to the point where the two streams met, hoping to find handholds that would allow him to search areas he hadn't yet reached. A misstep on algae-covered stone sent him plunging into the pool with enough force to drive all air from his lungs. The underwater experience was both terrifying and transformative. As Daniel fought to reach the surface, disoriented by the powerful currents and blinded by churning water, he found himself in a space that defied his understanding of the pool's geography. The water seemed deeper than his earlier observations had suggested, and the acoustic properties underwater created an environment where the bone whistle's calls seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. When he finally surfaced, gasping and shaken, Daniel realized that his near drowning had revealed something crucial about the site's hidden nature. The pool itself was part of the access system, not just a collection point for falling water, but an integral element of the cave's design. The underwater currents followed patterns that suggested artificial channels, and the acoustic effects indicated hollow spaces behind what appeared to be solid rock walls. That night, as Daniel recovered from his close call with drowning, he made a breakthrough in understanding the calendar fragment's instructions. The astronomical calculations weren't just about light angles, they were about specific moments when natural forces aligned to reveal hidden pathways. The entrance to the cave system wasn't permanently accessible. It was a doorway that opened only under precise conditions that occurred predictably but infrequently. Cross-referencing the calendar fragment with Miguel's decades of observations, Daniel calculated that the optimal viewing conditions would occur the following morning, approximately 30 minutes after sunrise, when the sun's angle would create the precise optical effect needed to reveal the hidden entrance. He spent the night in meditation and preparation, using the bone whistle to create musical patterns that seemed to resonate with the waterfall's natural rhythms. The pendant grew warm against his chest, and the calendar fragment seemed to pulse with subtle energy, as if all three artifacts were responding to his proximity to their original purpose. As dawn approached, Daniel positioned himself according to his grandfather's careful instructions, holding the calendar fragment at the precise angle indicated by its markings. The bone whistle hung ready around his neck, and the compass rose pendant pointed steadily toward magnetic north, creating a triangulation system that connected astronomical observation with terrestrial navigation. The sun rose through layers of mist and spray, casting light that transformed the waterfall into a prism of impossible beauty. And then, at exactly the moment Miguel's calculations had predicted, Daniel saw it a shimmer in the falling water that revealed the dark outline of an opening hidden behind the cascade, but clearly visible to anyone who knew exactly when and where to look. The entrance to his grandfather's obsession was finally within reach. The entrance to the cave system was both exactly what Daniel had expected and completely beyond his imagination. Following his grandfather's precise timing, he waded through the pool's icy water and pressed himself against the rock wall behind the eastern waterfall. The opening revealed itself as a natural archway, tall enough for a man to walk through upright, carved by centuries of water flow and shaped by hands that understood the sacred geometry of hidden places. Stepping through that archway felt like crossing a threshold between worlds. The thunderous roar of the waterfall immediately became muted, replaced by the gentle echo of dripping water and the whisper of air moving through vast underground spaces. Daniel's flashlight beam revealed a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of his light, its walls covered with mineral deposits that sparkled like stars in an underground sky. The preservation inside the cave was extraordinary. While the jungle outside struggled with the constant cycle of growth and decay, the cave's environment had remained stable for centuries. The temperature was cool but not cold, the humidity level perfect for preserving organic materials that would have disintegrated in the harsh conditions of the outside world. Daniel followed the tunnel deeper underground, guided by his grandfather's detailed map of the cave system's layout. Miguel had spent considerable time documenting multiple chambers, each with its own characteristics and contents. The main passage led to what the journal described as the heart of the sanctuary, a natural cathedral where the most significant artifacts had been preserved. As he walked deeper into the mountain, Daniel began to understand the site's true nature. This wasn't just a cave that had been used for storage, it was a deliberately designed sanctuary modified by generations of indigenous craftsmen who understood how to work with natural stone formations to create spaces that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The first chamber Daniel entered took his breath away. His flashlight illuminated walls covered with pictographs that told stories spanning centuries. Images of ceremonies, astronomical observations, and cultural traditions had been painted with pigments that remained vivid despite their obvious age. At the center of the chamber, on a natural stone platform, sat an object that made Daniel's hands tremble as he approached. The obsidian mirror was perfectly circular, about 18 inches in diameter, its surface polished to a reflectivity that seemed impossible for a material worked with ancient tools. The mirror was set in an elaborate frame of carved jade and gold, decorated with symbols that connected it to the other artifacts Daniel carried. Most remarkably, the mirror's surface showed not just reflections, but seemed to hold images that shifted and changed as he moved around it. Daniel examined the mirror with the careful attention of a trained historian, but he was unprepared for the emotional impact of actually seeing himself reflected in its surface. The man looking back at him wasn't the broken academic who had started this journey. It was someone older, wiser, marked by experiences that had stripped away illusions and revealed something more authentic underneath. As he studied the mirror, Daniel began to understand its function within the sanctuary's design. The obsidian surface didn't just reflect light, it reflected intention, showing viewers not just their physical appearance, but their spiritual readiness for the responsibilities that came with accessing sacred knowledge. The indigenous peoples who had created this place understood that true treasures required proper guardianship, and the mirror served as a test of character as much as a ceremonial object. Miguel's journal contained extensive notes about the mirror's significance, written in his grandfather's increasingly emotional handwriting as he struggled with the implications of his discoveries. The old cartographer had realized that the artifacts hidden in this sanctuary weren't just valuable in monetary terms. They were irreplaceable cultural treasures that had been stolen from communities that needed them for spiritual and spectral historical continuity. Daniel's reflection in the obsidian surface began to show him images that weren't quite memories and weren't quite visions. He saw the Spanish conquistadors who had looted these artifacts from indigenous communities, driven by greed and justified by religious superiority. He witnessed the guilt of later generations who recognized the injustice but lacked the courage to make restitution. Most powerfully, he experienced his grandfather's decades of anguish over knowledge that demanded action, but seemed to offer no clear path forward. The mirror revealed the true scope of what lay hidden in the cave system. Chamber after chamber contained artifacts that represented not just material wealth, but the cultural patrimony of multiple indigenous groups. Golden figurines that had been used in ceremonies connecting earthly communities with celestial powers. Ceramic vessels painted with star charts that recorded astronomical observations spanning centuries. Jade ornaments that marked the achievements of leaders whose names had been lost to colonial violence. Each artifact told a story of cultural sophistication that contradicted everything European colonizers had claimed about indigenous primitiveness. The mathematical precision of the astronomical instruments, the artistic brilliance of the decorative objects, and the spiritual depth reflected in ceremonial items all testified to civilizations that had achieved remarkable heights of knowledge and creativity before being devastated by foreign conquest. Daniel understood that his grandfather had spent his final years trying to process the moral weight of this knowledge. Miguel had discovered not just a treasure cave, but a repository of cultural memories that belonged to specific communities whose descendants still lived in the region. The guilt that had driven his obsessive research came from understanding that these artifacts were more than valuable objects. They were essential elements of cultural identity that had been violently separated from their right guardians. The obsidian mirror reflected Daniel's growing realization that finding the cave was only the beginning of his real challenge. His grandfather had left him more than maps and artifacts he had inherited, a moral obligation that transcended personal financial needs. The question wasn't whether these treasures were valuable enough to solve his problems, but whether he was worthy enough to solve theirs. As Daniel prepared to explore the deeper chambers, he felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders, like his grandfather's old military pack. The mirror showed him one final image before he moved on his own face, but marked with the same expression of determined responsibility that had characterized Miguel's later years. The broken man who had entered this sanctuary was being replaced by someone who understood that true wealth came from serving something larger than personal survival. The bone whistle, compass rose pendant, and stone calendar fragment had brought him to this moment of recognition. Now the obsidian mirror was showing him who he needed to become to honor the trust these artifacts represented. The journey toward the cave's deepest secrets would require more than physical courage. It would demand moral transformation that his grandfather had begun but never completed. The deeper chambers of the cave system revealed treasures that confirmed Daniel's growing understanding of his grandfather's moral burden. Following Miguel's carefully annotated map, he discovered room after room filled with artifacts that represented the sophisticated cultural achievements of pre-Columbian civilizations. Each object was perfectly preserved by the cave's stable environment, waiting centuries for someone to appreciate their true significance. In the chamber Miguel had designated as the Hall of Wings, Daniel found the artifact that would become central to his transformation. The golden condor totem stood nearly 3 feet tall, crafted from gold so pure it seemed to glow in his flashlight beam. The sculpture captured every detail of the magnificent bird in flight, from individual feather textures to the fierce intelligence in its obsidian eyes. The condor's wingspan stretched wide, as if preparing to soar through the underground cathedral, carrying prayers between earthly and celestial realms. But it was the inscriptions covering the totem's base that made Daniel's hands shake as he photographed them. Carved in multiple indigenous languages, the text told the story of the condor's cultural significance and, more importantly, identified the specific communities from which it had been stolen. The Spanish conquistador who had taken this sacred object had been careful to document its provenance, perhaps hoping that detailed records would somehow mitigate the spiritual crime of theft. Daniel spent hours studying the inscriptions with the help of his grandfather's translations, gradually understanding that the golden condor wasn't just ceremonial art, it was a spiritual anchor for communities that measured their connection to ancestral wisdom through their relationship with sacred objects. The totem represented generations of cultural continuity that had been violently interrupted by colonial conquest. Using his satellite phone to connect with the outside world for the first time since entering the cave, Daniel began researching the communities mentioned in the condor's inscriptions. What he discovered made his grandfather's guilt suddenly comprehensible. The descendants of the people who had created and revered these artifacts still lived in the region, their cultural traditions maintained despite centuries of oppression and displacement. The Quichemaya community that had created the golden condor still performed ceremonies honoring the sacred bird, but their rituals had been incomplete for centuries without their most powerful spiritual focus. Similar situations existed for dozens of other indigenous groups whose sacred objects lay hidden in the cave's chambers. The theft of these artifacts hadn't just been robbery, it had been cultural murder, severing spiritual connections that communities had spent generations trying to restore. Daniel's phone calls to archaeological institutions and indigenous rights organizations opened his eyes to the complexity of cultural repatriation in the modern world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of indigenous studies at the University of Guatemala, explained the legal and ethical frameworks that governed the return of stolen cultural property. These artifacts legally belong to the communities they were taken from, Dr. Vasquez told him during their lengthy conversation. But the process of returning them requires extensive documentation, community consultation, and often years of legal procedures. The fact that you found them doesn't give you ownership, it gives you responsibility. That responsibility grew heavier as Daniel explored more chambers and documented more artifacts. Golden figurines that had served as intermediaries between human and divine realms. Jade masks worn by spiritual leaders during transformation ceremonies. Ceramic vessels that had held sacred medicines and blessed waters. Each object represented not just artistic achievement, but spiritual technology that communities needed to maintain their connections with ancestral wisdom. Miguel's journal contained increasingly tortured reflections on this exact moral dilemma. The old cartographer had realized that his military intelligence work during World War II had inadvertently contributed to the systematic looting of archaeological sites. American forces, focused on defeating fascism, had often turned a blind eye to treasure hunters who operated under cover of military occupation. Miguel's precise mapping skills had been used to document sites that were later plundered by unofficial collectors who sold artifacts to private buyers in the United States and Europe. Daniel found his grandfather's final letter to him, hidden in a waterproof container behind the Golden Condor. Miguel's handwriting, shaky with age but still determined, conveyed decades of accumulated guilt and a desperate hope that his grandson would complete the mission he had been unable to finish. Daniel, if you are reading this, then you have found what I spent my life trying to understand. These artifacts are not treasures in any conventional sense. They are pieces of souls that were torn from their communities centuries ago. I was too much a coward to return them myself, too afraid of the legal complications and personal costs. But I have given you the knowledge and the opportunity to do what I could not. The monetary value of these objects is insignificant compared to their spiritual worth to the people they belong to. You must find the strength I lacked. You must make this right. The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Daniel's shoulders like a physical burden. His original motivation, finding treasure to solve his financial problems, seemed shamefully inadequate when measured against the cultural trauma these stolen artifacts represented. The $67 million valuation wasn't a promise of personal wealth. It was a measure of cultural devastation that demanded restoration rather than exploitation. That night, sleeping in the cave beside the Golden Condor, Daniel experienced dreams that felt more like ancestral memories than personal imagination. He witnessed the ceremonies where the Condor totem had served as a bridge between human communities and divine wisdom. He felt the spiritual anguish of generations who had performed incomplete rituals, knowing that their most powerful sacred objects were lost to colonial violence. Most powerfully, he experienced the hope that still lived in indigenous communities, that someday their cultural patrimony would be restored. Daniel woke with tears on his face and absolute clarity about his path forward. In the deepest chamber of the cave system, sealed behind a stone wall that had required careful removal according to Miguel's instructions, Daniel made the discovery that would redefine everything he thought he understood about his grandfather's quest. The chamber contained a waterproof metal container, clearly of modern manufacture, that had been placed there decades after the original artifacts. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved with military precision, was a leather-bound logbook that would shatter his assumptions about the cave's history. The colonial explorer's logbook belonged to Captain Diego Vasquez, a Spanish conquistador who had participated in the systematic looting of indigenous sacred sites during the early colonial period. But this wasn't a typical soldier's record of military campaigns. It was the tortured confession of a man whose conscience had been destroyed by the cultural crimes he had committed in service to empire and gold. Vasquez's entries, written in archaic Spanish that Daniel's academic training allowed him to decipher, told a story of increasing moral anguish as the conquistador witnessed the spiritual devastation caused by artifact theft. The captain had initially participated eagerly in the plunder, seeing indigenous sacred objects as nothing more than valuable gold and jade to be melted down or sold to European collectors. But prolonged exposure to indigenous communities had gradually revealed the true cost of cultural destruction. "I have seen mothers weep for sacred vessels as if they were children," Vasquez had written in one particularly anguished entry. "I have watched spiritual leaders perform ceremonies made incomplete by our theft of their most powerful objects. We have not merely taken treasure, we have murdered souls." The logbook documented Vasquez's growing realization that the artifacts he had helped steal were irreplaceable elements of sophisticated spiritual systems. Indigenous communities didn't view these objects as mere decorations or status symbols. They were living connections to ancestral wisdom, essential tools for maintaining cosmic balance, and repositories of cultural knowledge that had been accumulated across generations of careful observation and spiritual practice. Most remarkably, the logbook contained detailed provenance information for each artifact Vasquez had helped hide in the cave. The captain had meticulously recorded which objects belonged to which communities, including maps showing their original locations and descriptions of their ceremonial functions. This wasn't random documentation, it was a careful inventory created by someone who hoped that future generations might be able to return the stolen objects to their rightful guardians. But the logbook's most shocking revelation came in its final entries, where Vasquez revealed information that explained Daniel's powerful connection to this quest. The conquistador's guilt had driven him to marry an indigenous woman whose family had been devastated by artifact theft. Their children, raised with knowledge of both Spanish colonial culture and indigenous spiritual traditions, had inherited the moral obligation to someday restore what had been taken. Daniel traced the genealogical information with growing amazement and recognition. Vasquez's mixed heritage descendants had gradually migrated north over the centuries, carrying with them family stories about sacred objects hidden in a mountain cave and a spiritual debt that demanded eventual payment. The family name had changed through marriages and cultural assimilation, but the essential knowledge had been preserved through oral tradition until it reached Miguel Reyes, Daniel's grandfather. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't just been a guilt-ridden cartographer trying to correct historical injustices. He had been a descendant of the very conquistador who had originally stolen these artifacts. Miguel's obsession with returning the sacred objects wasn't academic or altruistic. It was ancestral obligation, a family debt that had been passed down through generations of mixed heritage descendants who carried the guilt of colonial crimes in their DNA. Daniel's own indigenous ancestry, hidden beneath generations of cultural assimilation and American identity, suddenly explained the spiritual connections he had felt throughout his journey. The bone whistle's responsiveness to his touch, the pendant's guidance through impossible terrain, the obsidian mirror's revelations about his character, these weren't coincidences or fantasy. They were recognition, acknowledgement from sacred objects that their rightful guardian had finally arrived. The logbook contained one final element that made Daniel's hands shake as he read it. Vasquez had included detailed instructions for a repatriation ceremony that would spiritually cleanse the artifacts of their colonial contamination and restore them to their proper relationships with the communities they served. The captain had learned this ceremony from his indigenous wife, who had insisted that any eventual return of the sacred objects must be accomplished according to proper spiritual protocols. But understanding his family's connection to the artifacts created a new moral complexity that Daniel hadn't anticipated. As a descendant of Diego Vasquez, he had inherited not just the responsibility to return the stolen objects, but also the spiritual burden of ancestral crimes. The artifacts weren't just culturally valuable items he happened to have found. They were his family's debt to indigenous communities, an obligation that had been accumulating interest for over 4 centuries. Daniel spent the night in the deepest chamber, surrounded by artifacts that represented both immense monetary value and immeasurable cultural significance, trying to process the weight of inherited guilt and responsibility. The golden condor seemed to watch him with obsidian eyes that held the patience of centuries, waiting for justice that had been delayed too long already. His satellite phone connection to the outside world brought conversations with Dr. Vasquez and other experts that confirmed the legal and ethical implications of his discovery. International law regarding cultural repatriation was complex, but the principle was clear. Indigenous communities had legitimate claims to sacred objects that had been stolen from them, regardless of how much time had passed or how many hands the artifacts had passed through. "Your situation is actually quite remarkable," Dr. Vasquez explained during one of their lengthy conversations. "Most cases of cultural repatriation involve artifacts with unclear provenance, making it difficult to determine their original communities. But Captain Vasquez's documentation provides exactly the kind of detailed information that makes proper repatriation possible. The implications extended beyond legal requirements to spiritual obligations that Daniel was only beginning to understand. The logbook's description of the repatriation ceremony indicated that the artifacts themselves needed to undergo spiritual cleansing before they could resume their proper functions within indigenous communities. Generations of separation from their original contexts had created spiritual wounds that required healing through traditional protocols. Daniel realized that his grandfather had spent decades preparing for this moment without fully understanding his own family's connection to the artifacts. Miguel had researched indigenous communities, learned about proper protocols for handling sacred objects, and even established connections with tribal elders, all while believing he was simply trying to correct historical injustices. The truth was that he had been unconsciously preparing to fulfill an ancestral obligation that had been passed down through his bloodline. As dawn broke over the waterfall outside, casting light through the cave's entrance and illuminating the golden condor's outstretched wings, Daniel made the decision that would define the rest of his life. The artifacts weren't his to keep or sell, they were his family's debt to pay. The $67 million valuation wasn't a measure of personal opportunity, but of ancestral responsibility that demanded immediate action. The broken academic who had entered the cave seeking financial salvation was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true wealth came from healing historical wounds rather than perpetuating them. Daniel Vasquez. He would reclaim the family name his ancestors had abandoned, would spend whatever remained of his life ensuring that these sacred objects found their way home. The ceremonial feather headdress waited for Daniel in the cave's most sacred chamber, a space his grandfather had designated as the heart of spiritual power, but had never dared to enter himself. The headdress was magnificent beyond description, hundreds of iridescent feathers arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living water, supported by a framework of gold and jade that incorporated astronomical symbols matching those on the other artifacts. According to Captain Vasquez's logbook, the headdress had belonged to a high-ranking spiritual leader whose authority encompassed multiple indigenous communities. The conquistador had stolen it during the sack of a ceremonial center, not understanding that he was taking the physical embodiment of intertribal leadership that had maintained peace and cooperation across vast territories for generations. Daniel approached the headdress with the reverence his journey had taught him was necessary when handling objects of such spiritual significance. As he lifted it carefully from its resting place, he felt a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. The feathers seemed to whisper with the voices of generations of leaders who had worn it during ceremonies that connected earthly communities with celestial wisdom. The logbook's instructions for the repatriation ceremony were explicit. The person overseeing the return of the artifacts must wear the leadership headdress during the process. accepting responsibility not just for the physical transfer of objects, but for the spiritual healing that needed to accompany their return. Daniel understood that putting on the headdress would transform him from a descendant seeking redemption into a bridge between worlds that colonial violence had torn apart. His satellite phone buzzed with messages from the outside world as news of his discovery began to spread. Dr. Vasquez had contacted indigenous community leaders throughout the region, explaining the situation and requesting their guidance on proper repatriation protocols. The response had been immediate, and overwhelming tribal councils that had spent centuries maintaining incomplete ceremonies were preparing to travel to the Waterfall site for what could be the most significant cultural restoration event in modern Central American history. But Daniel's phone also brought disturbing news. Government officials in both Guatemala and Belize had learned about the discovery and were making legal claims to the artifacts as part of their national patrimony. Treasure hunters and private collectors, alerted by internet rumors about a major find, were beginning to converge on the region. International media attention was building rapidly, threatening to transform the sacred repatriation ceremony into a circus of competing interests and commercial exploitation. Emma called from Portland, her voice tight with worry and confusion. "Dad, are you okay? There are news stories saying you found some kind of treasure cave, and people are saying it's worth millions of dollars. What's really happening down there?" Daniel tried to explain his decision to his daughter, but the words felt inadequate for the spiritual transformation he was experiencing. "Emma, I can't keep these artifacts. They belong to the indigenous communities they were stolen from. My responsibility, our family's responsibility, is to make sure they get home safely. But Dad, you were homeless. You had nothing. This could solve all your problems." Emma's voice carried the practical concern of a daughter who had watched her father lose everything and now couldn't understand why he would give up the chance for financial security. "Some problems can only be solved by doing what's right, even when it costs everything," Daniel replied, recognizing his grandfather's voice in his own words. "I'm not the same person who started this journey, Emma. I've learned things about our family, about history, about responsibility that I can't just ignore." Rosa, the indigenous elder who had recognized the compass rose pendant weeks earlier, arrived at the Waterfall site with a small group of community leaders. Her presence brought both validation and additional moral weight to Daniel's decision. She examined the artifacts with the careful attention of someone who understood their spiritual significance beyond any monetary value. "Your grandfather came to me many times over the years," Rosa told Daniel as they sat beside the waterfall pool. "He carried such sadness, such guilt about things that happened before he was born. I told him then what I tell you now. The ancestors understand the difference between those who steal and those who return. You have chosen the path of healing." The repatriation ceremony would require coordination between multiple indigenous communities whose ancestors had created different artifacts now stored in the cave. Tribal leaders were traveling from across Central America, many carrying ceremonial items that hadn't been used in complete rituals for centuries. The gathering would represent the largest intertribal cooperation in the region since before European contact. Daniel spent days working with community leaders to plan the ceremony according to protocols that honored both the spiritual significance of the artifacts and the legal requirements of international repatriation law. Government officials and archaeological experts would document the process, ensuring that the transfer met all legal standards while respecting indigenous sovereignty over their cultural patrimony. The practical challenges were enormous. Each artifact required individual assessment to determine its original community, proper ceremonial handling protocols, and specific requirements for spiritual cleansing. The Golden Condor alone involved representatives from 3 different Mayan groups whose ancestors had shared its ceremonial use across tribal boundaries. Legal challenges intensified as government officials and treasure hunters attempted to claim rights to the discovery. International lawyers specializing in cultural repatriation flew in from around the world, creating a complex legal environment that threatened to delay the ceremony indefinitely. Daniel found himself at the center of legal battles that extended far beyond his personal situation to fundamental questions about indigenous rights and cultural sovereignty. But the most significant challenge was internal. Daniel's own transformation, from desperate treasure hunter to cultural bridge builder, was still incomplete. Wearing the ceremonial headdress, he felt the weight of leadership he wasn't sure he deserved. The indigenous communities were treating him with respect that seemed disproportionate to his contributions, calling him the one who brings our children home, and including him in planning ceremonies he didn't fully understand. His estranged relationship with Emma began healing as she gradually understood the significance of his decision. She flew down from Portland to support him during the final preparations, bringing with her the practical skills and emotional intelligence that had made her successful in non-profit work. Together, they navigated the complex intersection of family legacy, indigenous rights, and international law that surrounded the repatriation process. Sarah, his ex-wife, surprised him with a phone call that carried none of the judgment he had expected. "I'm proud of you, Daniel," she said simply. "You found something more valuable than money. You found your purpose." The night before the ceremony, Daniel sat alone in the cave, surrounded by artifacts that would soon return to their proper communities. The obsidian mirror reflected a face he was still learning to recognize, weathered by hardship, but marked by the kind of peace that comes from aligning actions with values. The bone whistle hung silent around his neck, waiting for the ceremonial music that would guide the artifacts on their spiritual journey home. Government officials had agreed to support the repatriation after international pressure and legal advice confirmed that indigenous claims were legally unassailable. Treasure hunters had been warned away by increased security and international media attention that made any theft attempt politically impossible. The ceremony would proceed according to protocols that honored both ancient traditions and modern legal requirements. Daniel understood that tomorrow would mark not just the return of stolen artifacts, but the completion of a spiritual journey that had begun with his grandfather's guilt-ridden research and now culminated in ancestral redemption. The ceremonial feathered headdress rested on its ancient stand, waiting for him to accept the leadership role that would transform his life from personal survival to cultural service. The broken man who had entered the cave seeking treasure would emerge as a bridge between worlds, carrying forward the work his grandfather had begun but never completed. The weight of the headdress would be nothing compared to the lightness of finally fulfilling an obligation that had burdened his family for 4 centuries. The dawn of the repatriation ceremony brought mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself, transforming the waterfall clearing into a natural cathedral wrapped in ethereal clouds. Daniel stood at the edge of the pool, wearing the ceremonial feathered headdress that marked him as guardian and guide for the sacred object's return journey. The weight of hundreds of iridescent feathers felt like the accumulated prayers of generations, each plume carrying the hopes of communities that had waited centuries for this moment. Representatives from 7 indigenous communities had gathered in the clearing, each group bringing ceremonial items that hadn't been used in complete rituals since their sacred objects were stolen by colonial conquistadors. Elder Rosa moved among the groups with quiet authority, her presence serving as a bridge between different tribal traditions while maintaining the spiritual protocols necessary for such a significant ceremony. The treaty scroll that would provide legal foundation for the repatriation lay open on a natural stone altar that had been prepared according to ancient specifications. The document, written in multiple indigenous languages as well as Spanish and English, represented unprecedented cooperation between communities that had sometimes competed for resources, but now united in their desire to reclaim their cultural heritage. Dr. Vasquez arrived with a team of archaeologists and legal experts who would document every aspect of the ceremony to ensure it met international standards for cultural repatriation. Their presence represented the intersection of academic scholarship, indigenous rights, and international law that made this restoration possible. Camera, equipment, and documentation materials were arranged respectfully around the clearing's perimeter, capturing history while avoiding intrusion on sacred protocols. The golden condor emerged from the cave first, carried by Daniel with the careful reverence the ceremonial headdress demanded of him. The sculpture seemed to catch every ray of sunlight filtering through the mist, its outstretched wings creating shadows that danced across the faces of assembled community members. Gasps of recognition and tears of joy marked its appearance. Many of the elders present had heard stories of this sacred object from grandparents who remembered its power. Representatives from the Quiche Maya stepped forward to receive their ancestral guardian. The moment when tribal elder Maria Tujab first touched the golden condor after centuries of separation was electric with spiritual energy. Her hands trembled as she traced the intricate featherwork, and her voice broke as she whispered prayers in her ancestral language. The condor seemed to respond to her touch, its obsidian eyes reflecting light in ways that appeared almost alive. But the ceremony's emotional peak came when government officials attempted to assert national claims over the artifacts. A representative from Guatemala's Ministry of Culture stepped forward with legal documents declaring the treasures part of the country's national patrimony, arguing that they belonged in museums where they could be preserved and studied for the benefit of all humanity. The treaty scroll became Daniel's defense against governmental appropriation. The document, validated by international legal experts and supported by United Nations protocols on indigenous rights, clearly established that the artifacts belonged to the specific communities they had been stolen from, not to the modern nation-states that happened to control the territory where they were found. "These objects are not archaeological specimens," Daniel declared, his voice carrying the authority the ceremonial headdress granted him. "They are living elements of spiritual traditions that have been maintained by their rightful communities for centuries. Their proper place is not in museum cases, but in the ceremonies they were created to serve." Legal challenges intensified as treasure hunters who had tracked the discovery attempted to file competing claims based on salvage rights and finders' fees. International media attention complicated the situation, with reporters and camera crews threatening to turn the sacred ceremony into a commercial spectacle. Emma stood beside her father during these confrontations, her experience in non-profit advocacy proving invaluable as she coordinated with legal experts and indigenous rights organizations to protect the ceremony from external interference. She had begun to understand that her father's transformation from broken academic to cultural bridge builder represented something larger than personal redemption. It was ancestral healing that had implications for indigenous communities throughout the Americas. The obsidian mirror reflected these conflicts as Daniel used it to guide the ceremony, according to Captain Vasquez's instructions. The mirror's surface showed not just the physical gathering, but the spiritual dimensions of what was taking place. Ancestors witnessing the return of their sacred objects, communities preparing to resume complete ceremonial practices, and the healing of wounds that had festered for centuries. International legal victory came when UNESCO representatives arrived with documentation supporting indigenous claims and threatening sanctions against any government that attempted to prevent proper repatriation. The combination of legal pressure, media attention, and international oversight created an environment where governmental interference became politically impossible. The first phase of the ceremony concluded with Daniel formally presenting the treaty scroll to assembled community leaders, transferring legal and spiritual authority from his family's inherited guilt to the indigenous communities who had maintained their cultural traditions despite centuries of oppression. The moment marked not just the return of valuable objects, but the restoration of spiritual connections that colonial violence had severed. The Unity necklace was created during the ceremony itself, as representatives from different indigenous communities contributed stones from their ancestral territories to honor Daniel's role in returning their cultural heritage. Each stone carried the blessing of its community: turquoise from highland Maya villages, obsidian from volcanic regions where Pipil ancestors had worked volcanic glass, jade from riverbeds where Lenca craftsmen had gathered raw materials for ceremonial objects. Elder Rosa wove the stones together with traditional cordage made from plants that grew wild around the waterfall, her weathered hands working with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining cultural practices despite official discouragement. As she worked, she explained the necklace's significance to Daniel, whose role as ceremony guardian required him to understand the spiritual weight of what he was receiving. "This necklace represents more than gratitude," Rosa told him, as she carefully positioned each stone according to traditional patterns. "It marks your acceptance into communities that had been divided by colonial violence, but are now united by the return of their sacred objects. You carry the responsibility to continue this work, to help other stolen artifacts find their way home." The legal victory over governmental claims became complete when courts in both Guatemala and Belize ruled that indigenous communities had legitimate sovereignty over their cultural patrimony, regardless of where artifacts were found within modern national boundaries. The decisions set precedents that would affect similar cases throughout Latin America, strengthening legal protections for indigenous cultural rights across the hemisphere. Daniel's transformation reached its emotional climax as he removed the ceremonial feathered headdress and formally transferred its authority to traditional leaders who would oversee the artifact's integration back into ceremonial use. The moment felt like shedding a burden he had carried without understanding its weight, the guilt of ancestral crimes that had shaped his family's history for 4 centuries. International media coverage of the repatriation ceremony sparked global conversations about cultural justice and the responsibilities of descendants whose ancestors had participated in colonial appropriation. Daniel found himself reluctantly thrust into a public role as an advocate for cultural repatriation, his story inspiring similar efforts by other families who discovered their connections to historical theft. Emma's presence during the ceremony deepened their reconciliation, as she witnessed her father's transformation from desperate academic to someone who had found meaning larger than personal survival. She began planning to relocate from Portland to Central America, where she could apply her non-profit experience to supporting indigenous cultural preservation efforts. The final confrontation with treasure hunters came as the ceremony reached its spiritual peak. A group of mercenaries, hired by private collectors who had learned about the discovery through internet rumors, attempted to raid the cave while community members were focused on the return rituals. They underestimated both the number of people protecting the site and the legal framework that had been established to ensure the ceremony's completion. Local and international law enforcement, coordinated through UNESCO protocols, responded swiftly to protect the sacred site. The attempted theft became an international incident that further strengthened legal protections for indigenous cultural sites throughout the region. The mercenaries found themselves facing charges that included not just theft, but violations of international cultural heritage laws. Daniel's story went viral through social media, but for the right reasons. Not as another treasure hunter's fantasy, but as an example of how historical injustices could be addressed through moral courage and cultural respect. His decision to give up $67 million in potential personal wealth to return artifacts to their rightful communities inspired similar acts of repatriation throughout the Americas. The ceremony's completion brought transformation not just for Daniel, but for the indigenous communities whose sacred objects had finally come home. Rituals that had been incomplete for centuries could now be performed with their full spiritual power restored. Astronomical instruments could again serve their purpose in tracking celestial cycles. Ceremonial vessels could once more hold the sacred waters and medicines necessary for traditional healing practices. The Unity necklace settled around Daniel's neck with weight that felt both heavy and liberating. Heavy with the responsibility it represented. Liberating because it marked the end of his family's centuries-long burden of guilt. The stones from different communities created a physical manifestation of the cultural bridges his work had helped rebuild. Sarah's phone call that evening carried pride and understanding that surprised Daniel. "You found something more valuable than treasure," she told him. "You found your place in the world." Her words marked not just personal reconciliation, but recognition that his transformation had created possibilities. None of them had imagined when his academic career ended in failure. The final artifact transfers continued through the evening, with each sacred object returned according to protocols that honored both its spiritual significance and the communities that had maintained its memory through centuries of separation. The cave behind the waterfall, emptied of its colonial burden, could now serve its original purpose as a sacred site where different communities could gather for ceremonies that transcended tribal boundaries. As night fell over the waterfall clearing, Daniel understood that his journey was not ending but transforming. The broken man who had entered the jungle seeking financial salvation had become a bridge between worlds, carrying forward work that would define the rest of his life. The Unity necklace would remind him daily that some victories were measured not in dollars saved, but in wounds healed and connections restored. 6 months after the repatriation ceremony, Daniel sat in his small office in Guatemala City, writing in a new leather journal that would document his work as a cultural repatriation consultant. The fresh pages represented a future he couldn't have imagined when he'd started this journey as a desperate man chasing his grandfather's treasure-hunting fantasies. The new teaching journal served the same purpose as his old lesson plans, but now his classroom was the entire hemisphere, and his students were institutions learning to correct historical injustices. The transformation of his life had been as complete as it was unexpected. Museums throughout Latin America sought his expertise in identifying artifacts that belonged to specific indigenous communities, while universities invited him to lecture on the intersection of family history, moral responsibility, and cultural justice. The work paid modestly but meaningfully, providing enough income for a simple apartment and the travel necessary to support repatriation efforts across the region. Emma had moved to Antigua, where she established a non-profit organization that helped indigenous communities navigate the legal complexities of reclaiming their cultural patrimony. Their relationship, damaged by years of disappointment and miscommunication, had healed through shared purpose that honored both his academic knowledge and her practical advocacy skills. Working together on repatriation cases had revealed strengths in their partnership that neither had recognized when she was simply his worried daughter. Sarah visited occasionally, their former marriage transformed into a friendship based on mutual respect rather than romantic attachment. She brought news from their old life in Texas, updates on former colleagues and students who remembered Daniel as a passionate teacher rather than a failure. Her nursing work had given her perspective on healing that applied to more than physical wounds. She understood that Daniel's journey had addressed spiritual injuries that had affected his family for generations. The cave behind the waterfall had become a protected cultural site, managed cooperatively by the indigenous communities whose artifacts had been returned and supported by UNESCO designation as a World Heritage location. Daniel served on the advisory board that oversaw access to the site, ensuring that researchers and visitors approached it with the respect necessary for such a sacred place. His grandfather's original journal occupied a place of honor in the cultural center that had been established to document the repatriation process and educate visitors about the historical context of colonial artifact theft. Miguel's decades of research had become the foundation for ongoing efforts to identify and return sacred objects throughout Central America. His guilt-driven obsession transformed into a resource for healing historical wounds. The Teaching Award plaque from Daniel's former life found a new home on his office wall, no longer a reminder of failure, but evidence of his lifelong commitment to education. The skills that had made him effective in college classrooms, the ability to make historical events feel immediate and personal, now served a larger purpose in helping institutions understand their responsibilities to indigenous communities. International recognition of Daniel's work had brought opportunities he was still learning to navigate. The United Nations had invited him to serve on a commission developing global protocols for cultural repatriation, while the Organization of American States sought his input on legislation protecting indigenous cultural rights. The broken academic who had lived in his truck just months earlier now found himself consulted by governments and international organizations. But the most meaningful recognition came from the communities whose artifacts he had helped return. The Unity necklace had been joined by other gifts that marked his acceptance into extended families across the region. A carved jade pendant from Mayan elders, a silver bracelet from Lenca artisans, a woven belt from people communities whose sacred vessels had found their way home through his work. Daniel's modest apartment contained a growing collection of photographs documenting successful repatriation ceremonies he had facilitated. Each image captured moments of profound emotional healing as communities reconnected with sacred objects that had been stolen from their ancestors. The golden condor now soared again in traditional ceremonies, its presence completing rituals that had been fractured for centuries. The financial security he had desperately sought when this journey began came not from treasure hunting, but from work that aligned with his deepest values. Grant funding for repatriation research, consulting fees from museums seeking to correct historical wrongs, and speaking honoraria from universities exploring cultural justice issues provided income that met his needs without compromising his principles. Emma's nonprofit had grown into a regional network that helped indigenous communities throughout Latin America identify and reclaim their cultural patrimony. Her generation approached the work with energy and technological resources that complemented Daniel's historical knowledge and moral authority. Together, they had facilitated the return of dozens of sacred objects, each repatriation healing wounds that had festered since colonial times. The new journal's early entries documented cases that were becoming increasingly complex as word of their success spread throughout the region. Private collectors who had unknowingly purchased stolen artifacts were beginning to contact them voluntarily, while museums were proactively reviewing their collections for objects that belonged to indigenous communities. The momentum created by the Waterfall ceremony was generating systemic changes in how institutions approached cultural patrimony. Daniel's writing had evolved from desperate planning to reflective documentation of experiences that transcended his personal transformation. The journal entries read like field notes from someone mapping the intersection between individual moral choice and collective historical healing, recording lessons that might guide future generations facing similar challenges between personal benefit and cultural responsibility. The Unity necklace rested on his desk as he wrote, its stones from different communities serving as a constant reminder that some victories created connections rather than conquests. The weight of inherited guilt had been replaced by the satisfaction of inherited purpose, transforming his family's colonial burden into a bridge between worlds that historical violence had torn apart. As evening light slanted through his office window, illuminating pages filled with careful observations about the ongoing work of cultural healing, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate treasure hunting to meaningful service. The grandfather's journal that had started it all lay open beside him, its maps now obsolete, but its moral imperative fulfilled at last. The broken man who had entered the jungle seeking salvation had found something more valuable than treasure. He had discovered that redemption came not from taking, but from returning, not from personal gain, but from collective healing. The teaching award plaque caught the last rays of sunlight like a promise kept, reflecting the understanding that education's highest purpose was helping wounded worlds remember how to heal themselves.